That's a great way to to frame the question. Bad future, and I would say that this is already our bad present. Actually, state capitalism is here to stay in the near future. So the question is how it's going to develop. The climate crisis and the unraveling of US-led hegemony and world order are going to act as further catalysts to state capitalist transformations. We can already see some pretty scary stuff at play. The increasingly indistinguishable fusion of state-owned and private corporate actors working alongside each other across government, industry, and national security. A form of state capitalism where you would have the political imperative of raison d'etat against both the enemy within the nation and also against menacing geopolitical rivals, which would justify the uncontrolled use of state repression, surveillance, and so on.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga.
The rise of Chinese capitalism under the aegis of its party state, in Central Asia the development of patrimonial forms of capitalism dependent on rent from oil and gas exports in Russia and Kazakhstan, in Central and Eastern Europe the emergence of state-led illiberal regimes in countries like Hungary, Serbia and Poland, in the Middle East and North Africa the reconfiguration of the Arab Gulf economies and their particularly entangled combinations of state and capital, the large state-owned sectors of countries like Egypt, Jordan and Algeria, the development of an authoritarian political economy in Turkey and an innovation state in Israel, the precarious consolidation of extractivist and redistributive regimes in Latin America, Brazil during the Workers' Party period, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Venezuela, and in Africa, Zambia, Rwanda, or Ethiopia, developmentalist resource nationalisms in Malaysia and Indonesia, in Western Europe, the revival of techno-nationalism, extensive support to national champions and development banking, in the United States, a newfound appetite for state intervention and financial sanctions in the context of a second Cold War with China. Hello, welcome to BungaCast, the Global Politics podcast. At the end of history, I'm Alex Hochuli in Sao Paulo, Brazil. I'm joined once again by the wonderful Lee Jones in London. Hello, Lee. Good afternoon.
Are you okay after that? You sound like you need a drink.
No, I will certainly have a drink. You never podcast without drinking. I'm not an amateur, Lee. And we were very happy to welcome Ilias Alami, political economist, assistant professor in the political economy of development at the University of Cambridge, and the co-author of a book that you may have guessed we will be discussing called The Spectre of State Capitalism. This book has intrigued me deeply, and I think it answers a lot of questions that I already had. Hopefully, it will do likewise for you, listener, as we go through this. Ilias, welcome. Hello.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
I'm very excited to get started. So maybe just to start off, state capitalism. What do you mean by state capitalism? Could you give us a few indicators of the phenomenon?
Yes, I can. What we mean by state capitalism in the book is a global expansion of the role of the state as a promoter of capital accumulation, but also as an industrial policy actor, as an investor, shareholder, and as a direct owner of capital and assets. Now, we argue that this is something which has happened globally over the past 20 years, and it's manifested in two broad ways. The first one is that we've seen a multiplication of state-owned corporate entities, by which we mean things like sovereign wealth funds, state enterprises, state-owned banks, state-owned venture capital funds, and other state capital hybrids. Now, those have proliferated across the world economy, and there's also been a spectacular expansion of the assets they control. So to give a few examples and a few indicators to illustrate that, as of 2025, there are about 180 sovereign wealth funds, which I should say are state-owned or state-controlled investment funds. So this is nearly 7 times more than 20 years ago. And they control assets worth more than $14 trillion in 2025, which is a massive increase from less than $1 trillion in 2000. And I should also say that we're talking about very large sums of money here, because this is more than private equity firms and hedge funds combined. We've also seen a multiplication of state-owned enterprises. According to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, those now account for 20% of the world's 2,000 largest firms, which is twice as many as 20 years ago. And they control more than $54 trillion of assets, which is equivalent to half of global GDP. Another relevant example here is that of state-owned banking. There's been a multiplication of state-owned banks and a vast expansion of their loan portfolio and financial capacities. According to a recent estimate, there's more than 900 state-owned banks worldwide, controlling assets worth $50 trillion. Now, at the same time, as we've seen a multiplication of these state-owned corporate entities and a rapid expansion in the assets they control, we've also seen what we call in the book the development of muscular forms of statism, which is the sort of second modality of state capitalism we discuss. Now, that includes things like industrial policies, national development strategies, state-coordinated investment in infrastructure, and, of course, trade and investment restrictions. Again, just to give you a few figures to illustrate this, according to UNCTAD, which is the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, globally, the rate of adoption of industrial policies is at an all-time high. The rate of adoption of trade and investment restrictions as well has grown rapidly over the past 20 years, and that includes things like export controls, bans on foreign technologies, foreign investment screening mechanisms, so this is when governments screen and block inward investment, and also things like capital controls. So to wrap up, what we call in the book a new state capitalism is this combined expansion of, on the one hand, those state-owned corporate entities, and on the other hand, the development of increasingly muscular forms of statism, which has taken place over the past 20 years. So the purpose of the book is really to understand why this has happened. And again, to be clear, this is something which has happened globally, so not just in China or in East Asia or emerging markets.
Yeah, that's very useful, both in portraying this idea that, well, yeah, that it's not just a China story, but also that it's rather new. And we're going to get into how new and how much it develops out of the old and so on, I guess, as we go through this. Lee.
Yeah, so Ilias, can you flesh out state capitalism a little bit? I want to say up front that this is an outstanding piece of work. It's one of the most important works of political economy of the last 20 years, in my view. And it's just a phenomenal book that I encourage everybody to read. But can you just flesh out state capitalism a little bit more for us? You talk about the new state capitalism. A lot of the book is about trying to, I suppose, normalize state intervention and say this is not something new. The impulse for the state to take this role in capitalism is there even in liberal forms of capitalism. But what's new is this kind of surge and the way that these different forms of state capitalism are interacting with each other, such that ostensibly within a global neoliberal economy, we're seeing the rise of much more muscular forms of state intervention. And you talk about four different kinds of these state capitalist impulses: productivist, absorptive, stabilizing, and disciplinary. I think it might be really helpful for readers to kind of dig down a bit beyond the headlines. Tell us what these four different impulses involve.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for the very kind words on the book. Much appreciated. Okay, so before I say what those four state capitalist impulses are, I think what I want to say first is that, and this is perhaps preempting a bit one of the questions you may ask later, but one of the core claims we make in the book is that the roots of this phenomenon, this new state capitalism, are to be found in the historical development of global capitalism over the past 2 decades. And in particular, and so we kind of unpack those roots in the book with some depth, but just for the sake of brevity here, I'll mention 2 world historic mutations, which we argue in the book are absolutely fundamental to understand the rise of this new state capitalism. The first one is the formation of increasingly complex global value chains, which has led to a drastic rebalancing of the world economy in geographic terms, and the formation of new forms of multipolarity. And the second world historic mutation, which is really key to understand this new state capitalism, is the question of economic stagnation, which has worsened a lot over the past 20 years as well, in relation to questions of industrial overcapacity. Now, those things have in turn led to an intensification of competition between firms and states over trade, investment, markets, technology, and so on. So, to come back to your question, the argument we're making is that states around the world, in both the global north and the global south, have not been passive observers of these two transformations, but rather, or quite the contrary, they've been very directly implicated in them, whether they wanted it or not. Now, as they have done so, as they've been implicated in those transformations by politically mediating them, states have been compelled to re-embrace state ownership and to reinvent their roles as industrial policy actors, as investor shareholders, and as direct owners of capital and assets. Now, the reason I'm saying all that is that, leading to your question, we argue that this process of political mediation has been driven by four logics, which are those four state capitalist impulses you've mentioned. The productivist state capitalist impulse, the absorptive, the stabilizing, and the disciplinary one. Now, just to say a few words about those impulses, the first one, which we call the productivist state capitalist impulse, is essentially about states intervening more directly, or trying to do so, the productive arrangements of the global economy, and especially into the competitive dynamics of productive and extractive capital. To give some concrete examples, if you look at states in the advanced capitalist world, in the West and in East Asia, those states have developed new forms of techno-industrial policies to coordinate the emergence of technological frontiers in sectors such as advanced semiconductors, nanotechnologies, AI, advanced materials, clean tech, and so on. So, for instance, Germany, has launched its National Industrial Strategy 2030, which aims at developing so-called Industry 4.0. China has launched its Made in China 2025 Industrial Policy Plan, which is about breaking into the more advanced technological sectors of the world economy. The EU has launched a bunch of plans as well. The US has launched its US CHIPS Act, which is about competing in the sector of advanced semiconductors, and so on and so forth. Now, in developing countries, this productivist state capitalist impulse looks a bit different. Often it takes the form of attempts on the part of government to insert territories and firms into global value chains with the hope of attracting investment and achieving a form of economic diversification and industrial upgrading. Hence the design of new development strategies emphasizing connectivity within global value chains. Again, a few examples. Ecuador's Plan Nacional de Desarrollo, in Senegal, Plan Sénégal Émergent, in Kenya's Vision 2030, Indonesia's Vision 2045, and so on and so forth. Another example of productivist state capitalist impulse in the global south has been the renationalization of natural resources, particularly in the energy and mining sector. And here the point was for the government to try and capture some of the rents from the export of primary commodities, but also to reincorporate state enterprises in national development strategies. We've seen plenty of that happening in countries as diverse as Brazil, Mexico, Uganda, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, and elsewhere. Now, this is increasingly happening in the global north as well, and a good example of that is, under the Trump 2.0 administration, the Pentagon has just announced that it's taken a 50% equity stake in MP Materials, which is a private firm, and which is the US largest rare earth producer. And a final example that I wanted to give on this is that of the Japanese Ministry of Trade and Industry, the famous MITI, which has launched a new fund in order to basically retain control of Japanese firms in the semiconductor sector. And this is an attempt at retaining control over strategic technologies, key infrastructure, and strategic intellectual property. So this is the productivist state capitalist impulse. Now moving to the stabilizing state capitalist impulse. Now this is about states trying to mitigate crises or to limit economic volatility, to prop up the value of financial assets, or to preserve domestic political orders. Now here, states have remobilized state-owned banks and central banks to absorb bad debts or to manage toxic assets or to backstop financial systems. Plenty of this happened after the global financial crisis of 2008, but also after the crisis which were triggered by COVID or by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So things like quantitative easings, bank bailouts, and so on were all driven by this logic. What we've seen as well is the use of sovereign wealth funds or state enterprises by the state to consolidate the power of domestic elites by controlling resources or by distributing rents to clients. This is something that we've observed in plenty of countries as well, from Hungary to Turkey, Singapore, and elsewhere. And the third aspect I'll mention about this stabilizing state capitalist impulse is the use of things like sovereign wealth funds and policy banks to try and stabilize the economy by acting as a macroeconomic buffer or by using those sovereign wealth funds and those state-owned banks as tools of counter-cyclical management. The objective here is to try and protect the economy against external shocks. We've seen plenty of that in countries like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Bolivia, Hungary, Brazil, Indonesia, and others. Now, the third state capitalist impulse we talk about in the book is what we call the absorptive state capitalist impulse. So this is about the state trying to absorb and recycle economic surpluses by putting them into motion as financial capital, and to facilitate the reinvestment of those surpluses across sectors and geographies. So for example, this is about governments using sovereign wealth funds to reinvest the vast amounts of foreign exchange reserves or export proceeds that they have accumulated. And they can do this by seeking higher returns, by investing those reserves in a broader range of asset classes, from real estate to finance and insurance, trade, retail, media, healthcare, football clubs, manufacturing, and so on. Finally, the fourth state capitalist impulse we discuss in the book is what we call the disciplinary state capitalist impulse. And this one has also two aspects to it. The first one is that this is about the state trying to discipline other states, notably by engaging in aggressive forms of geopolitics, with the objective of reshaping globalization in ways that benefit them. So this is about states deploying both offensive and defensive measures, such as the ones that I mentioned earlier. So things like trade and investment restrictions, sanctions, economic nationalist policies, mercantilist policies, and so on. Obviously, plenty of examples in the news about this, with Trump's trade wars, of course, being one of the most prominent examples. But the second and very important aspect of the disciplinary state capitalist impulse is about states trying to discipline their own working classes and surplus populations. And that includes things like, the more explicit and naked use of state violence to suppress dissent and to impose social control. This is also about aggressive border militarization. This is about the development of AI-powered systems of mass surveillance and the suspension of the rule of law and civil liberties, which is something that we've observed in both so-called illiberal regimes, but also in nominally liberal democratic political systems as well. So to conclude my answer to this question, the point we're making in the book is that combinations of these four state capitalist impulses, those four logics, have been observable across the world economy and have profoundly shaped how states intervene over the past 20 years.
Yeah, that's hugely useful in bringing these things together, because I hadn't often thought of these things in the same moment as part of the same thing, effectively part of state capitalism. I mean, we've talked about kind of repression of domestic protests, for example, but thinking of that in the same moment as thinking of bailouts for companies and productive, public investment funds, for example. I think that's very useful to bring these all together.
Yeah, this is why the book is so good. It's because it gives you a total Marxist account of things that seem to be separate and different, but is in fact a picture of a particular moment within the development of the global capitalist economy operating on different scales. and manifesting in very different ways in different places, but can be seen as part of a total social whole. And the book is brilliant at bringing those things out. Now, let's think a bit about what this tells us about capitalism as a whole. So your explanation about why all this is happening, Ilias, is that states are responding to rising competition from the International Division of Labour and secular stagnation in the economy, overaccumulation of capital, industrial overcapacity, and so on. And the way that you present it is the state is being compelled to intervene in various ways to try to manage these problems. And I just wonder what this tells us about I suppose, both the health of contemporary capitalism and the role of the state now and historically. I think the way that you look at this, and this comes out, I think, explicitly in the conclusion, is that you think both capitalism and the state are actually weak. So although the state seems to be intervening in a much more muscular way, in a much more authoritarian and violent way, there's actually a sign of fragility. And the fact that the state is having to intervene in this way after decades where we were told the state's the problem, the state just needs to get out of the way and let the buccaneering capitalists do all the work, would also suggest that capitalism is weak today. But then as you were speaking, I was thinking about, think about this in the longue durée. When you get beyond small-scale capitalism, maybe the state is always necessary. State intervention has always been necessary on a massive scale. If we think to the 19th century, we had, of course, trade and industrial policies, but obviously imperialism as well as the mainstay of capitalist development. In the kind of middle of the 20th century, as that regime fell apart amid wars, you had Keynesianism, you had the post-colonial developmental state, you had Bretton Woods, a system of managing and allowing states to manage their economies. Then you had this brief period of neoliberalism where you're trying to roll back the state or to roll out a pro-market form of state. And then we get state capitalism. So I was going to ask you, does the fact that Western capitalists now also seem to need the state, not just weak post-colonial capitalists who always needed the state to help them, tell us something about Western capitalism? But maybe actually I'm kind of revising that as I was listening to you and thinking that actually capitalism has really always needed the state when we get to the global level of accumulation.
Yes, thank you. Great question. Lots to say, lots to unpack here, but I'll start by saying that one of the conceptual difficulties was to do justice to the fact that, of course, the history of state capitalism is arguably as old as the history of capitalism itself as a mode of production, since its birth in the long 16th century. The state has always been absolutely crucial to the development and expansion of capitalism, whether in the form of itself driving the expansion of capitalist social relations, or in terms of delivering some absolutely key inputs for capitalism, such as money and the law and policing the labor force and so on, or as a direct supporter of private capitalists. So this is essential to recognize, of course, and to integrate in our theorization efforts. And so that also means that the present period of state capitalism has a lot of historical antecedents, many of which indeed look quite similar to what is happening today. You could argue that sovereign wealth funds are in fact a form of state-owned investment fund, which has a very, very long history. We could date those at least from the beginning of the 20th century. You could also say that state enterprises have even older ancestors in the form of imperial charter companies, which were extremely strange from our contemporary perspective, blends of sovereign power and private profiteering.
Company states.
Yeah, absolutely, company states. So this is all important to recognize. However, what we do argue is in the book is that what's important to do is try and understand why those state capitalist impulses might manifest at specific historical periods. Now, our attempt at locating this present-day state capitalism within those two world historic mutations in global capitalism, the question of stagnation and the question of the international division of labor, I mean, those are new things. Those are things which are associated with the historical development of capitalism at the present historical juncture. So what is, of course, the interesting question here in terms of how we periodize state capitalism is by anchoring our understanding of this phenomenon today in the development of those new economic transformations. So that's one thing. So coming back to your point on the strength or not, or rather weakness in this case, of capitalism and its state, well, yes, one of the points we try and make in the book, particularly in the conclusion, is that we should not understand this phenomenon of state capitalism as a sign of strength and vitality on the part of the capitalist system as a mode of production and on the part of the state as the political form of that mode of production. Quite the contrary. In fact, we would argue is that this phenomenon denotes fragility and instability, again, rather than robustness and strength or vitality. And this is something we can say both for capitalism and for the state. So the story that we tell in the book is not one of, an all-powerful capitalist state which would be smoothly transforming itself in accordance with the requirements of capitalism, nor is this about the state successfully containing the tensions and conflicts that emanate from the development of capitalism. Rather, what we want to emphasize is that those state capitalist impulses are messy, they're crisis-driven, they tend to be always incomplete, and quite vulnerable to roll back as well. So in other words, this is a sign of the state, stumbling and failing forward, rather than strategizing about how to address political conflicts and contradictions and so on. And failing forward under the weight of capitalism's historical development, its contradictions, the conflicts it creates, both in class terms and in geopolitical terms. This is very obvious now in the clear context of geopolitical crispation that we are seeing today. So, and I should say too that we're not trying to predict the terminal crisis or an imminent collapse of capitalism, but really, again, this is to emphasize the frailty of the state capitalist moment. And I should say that this argument speaks directly to the question of decline, which you've been discussing quite extensively on the podcast. So I would certainly agree with the argument that this new state capitalism partly mirrors the inability of capitalist classes, for the most part, to cope with the morbid symptoms of this capitalist decline at the current historical juncture.
I wanted to pick up on something you've said, I think, and I think you kind of say this throughout the book, really, the idea that states are compelled to behave in this way. The way that I read your book is that there's basically a kind of structural functionalist argument going on here, right? So states have always been core to the production and reproduction of capitalism, and they therefore just have to do what is necessary to keep the show on the road amid these big structural problems. You're not quite as crude as that, but that I think is broadly the story. There's not very much sense of politics, agency, conflict, struggle here, although you do say, as you just said now, it's all very messy and it's improvisational and, subject to contestation and reversal. And that is a very important insight, but there's not very much of a theory of politics here. That there's not, for example, we don't see specific policies emerging because certain oligarchic factions lobby for it or particular fractions of capital are very powerful within particular states. And I just wonder whether that's something missing from your story here, because that might also help to explain variations in the kinds of policies that we see. Different sectors get promoted differently in different places. And in terms of the efficaciousness of state capitalist interventions, the West is pretty bad at it, it seems to me. They're being forced into it against their will. They've really lost the memory muscle of doing this stuff after years of neoliberalism. But you can see them responding to particular forms of lobbying from within their business elites, for example, the tech sector in the United States, whereas you've got a much more kind of robust capitalist class or state capitalist class in places like China, where it's much more, the policies are not without their problems, limitations, contradictions, and all the rest of it, but they seem to be much better in actually producing stuff and mobilizing capital for productive ends, for example. So I just wonder whether, is that, do you agree with that? Is it just it's just related to the fact that you're operating at quite a high level of abstraction? You're trying to generalize something across the entire world. Where's agency? Where's politics come into this story?
Yes, thank you. Great point. Great question too. A few things to say here. One is that I guess I would accept the charge of structuralism and maybe embrace it, in that, yes, the book does try to locate contemporary state capitalism, those state transformations within the long historical development of global capitalism, which, as a good Marxist, I believe to be a social order which is subject to a particular set of compulsions, crisis tendencies, even laws of motion, and so on and so forth. So if that is structuralist, then yes, I would say that the book is indeed structuralist. Although I would disagree with the claim that the kind of Marxian form analysis of the state that we mobilize for our analysis is actually structuralist. But that's a bit of a rabbit hole that we don't need to get into right now. Now, in terms of the point you made on functionalism, this one I think I would push back against a bit more, because what we're trying to do in the book is not really to derive our explanation of these transformations from, say, general state functions conceived in the abstract, but rather by looking at how states have concretely dealt with a series of contradictions, problems, challenges that we can observe. And they have done so in a very concrete way, as they have engaged as part of their, role in the historical development of capitalism. So, I would sort of push back against the claim that the analysis is functionalist in that sense. And so, to put it perhaps in simpler terms, we're not saying that states had to embrace state capitalism by necessity or because they had to, but we're trying to explain with some precision why this has happened in terms of, again, state attempts to deal with certain concrete challenges and contradictions. So this is just to sort of clarify what we're trying to do in the book. Now, yes, this is also not to say, again, that this had to happen this way, nor that all of those attempts on the part of states were successful. So there's no sort of functional relation here in our argument between the state, its role, and then capitalism. Now, without out of the way, I would completely agree with you that, domestic politics are fundamental to understanding how those state capitalist impulses manifest concretely on the ground. And that's because, of course, they don't fly over us. They are always locally embedded in particular class political projects, in particular configurations of class and conflict and so on. And so in order to understand really how and why state capitalist impulses manifest in specific contexts, it is crucial to look indeed at how those open-ended struggles and conflicts between classes and within classes as well, intra-capitalist struggles being quite important here, unfold in the real world. As you suggested in your question, the sort of bird's eye view that we adopt in the book is, makes it difficult to do justice to the richness of those and to the liveliness of those domestic politics. So we do acknowledge that they're really important, and in fact, I would say that there are contexts and countries where it is very clear that state capitalist impulses are quite significantly driven by domestic fractions of capital, often pretty close to state power. Can mention the example here of Thailand or Morocco or Singapore, Hungary, Turkey, and many others. But all of those cases are very different. The class configurations are quite different, but what they have in common is that it is relatively easy to identify segments of capital with connections to state power, and they seem to be pushing quite hard for re-embracing state ownership, muscular forms of statism, and so on and so forth. That said, we also wanted to push back again a little bit in the book against analysis that overemphasize domestic politics and domestic social forces. There is a tendency that we may call politicism, using a term that was used in Marxist debates in the 70s, which is to attribute, or which is to consider state capitalism in domestic context as the pure product of domestic social forces, which we obviously argue is not the case, because there are those absolutely fundamental planetary transformations which we identify in the book, which are cutting across all of those different political contexts. And therefore, there are some pretty powerful forces operating behind the backs of those state managers, capitalists, and so on and so forth. But to cut the story short, both things are important: the fundamental planetary capitalist transformations and the domestic politics. And again, it is true that in some cases, it is true that some segments of the capitalist class are pushing for that stuff. That said, and this is my final point here, there are also many, many cases, some of which I know quite well because I'm a long observer of those contexts, like France, or because I've done research in those countries, where it's pretty much impossible to actually identify political projects on the part of capitalist classes which would be sufficiently articulated and organized to push for those transformations. In fact, there are also many cases, such as the UK, where you would have the state, doing mild forms of industrial policy, seemingly against the will of very powerful segments of the capitalist class. Same in France, same in other countries like that. So, in other words, and quite frankly, I don't know why really this is the case. I mean, is this because those capitalist classes are disorganized? Is it because they're weak? Or is it perhaps paradoxically that they are too powerful in relation to labor in the context of weak accumulation? I think this is also perhaps a hypothesis to consider here. But anyways, I guess what I want to say is that overall, it's not possible, in my view, to identify a particular ideal, typical fractions of capital which would be driving those state capitalist transformations.
That's really interesting. I wanted to push you more on that, actually. But I mean, I think you did kind of spell out what the possible hypotheses are. But I'm intrigued by those tensions precisely, in which there's a tendency towards state capitalist policies of various different types that you've enumerated, and that the capitalist class might be against it or not pursue it, and yet these things kind of emerge anyway through some miracle of power politics somehow. But yeah, I maybe wanted to ask you to say a little bit more about that final hypothesis. I know this is maybe just a little bit, it's not something that you treat so much in the book, but now that you've mentioned it, this question about the weakness of labor and capital's huge relative power with regard to labor nowadays in a country maybe like France, whatever, for the sake of argument, and how that leads them not to be able to act in the interests of capital in general for France, and that the state has to step in and do that. I don't know if that's exactly the lines on which you're talking on.
Yeah, this is where I was getting at, really. I mean, here I'm hugely appreciative of the work of someone like Frédéric Lordon, former political economist who became a philosopher and who's, I think, a really keen observer of French politics. And one of his key points is that the French ruling class is completely unhinged. They see no limitation whatsoever on their power. So they're too empowered in relation to labor, and therefore are completely unable to even recognize when there's a complete crisis of their hegemony, when there would need to be a form of concession in order to reconstruct a modicum of political order and consent on the part of the dominated classes. They're just incapable of seeing that, and therefore incapable of articulating a an accumulation strategy, not even speaking about a hegemonic project. And their demands on the state are completely disarticulated, incoherent, inconsistent, and lack strategy. So what the state does in France is partly a reflection of that, but it's aware that it cannot only do that, which is giving out tax cuts and large subsidies and all that kind of stuff, which it does. There's a very strong tendency towards corporate welfarism in the French context. But the state also tries to do other things, such as a bit of industrial policy with more or less success, re-embracing state ownership to some extent. In other words, experimenting a bit with all the signature forms of state capitalism that I talked about earlier. And quite frankly, I don't think the state is doing this at all because it is pushed by capital. It is doing this because it is fucking desperate to do anything in that context and just doesn't know what, which is where it's important to emphasize that states, as they experiment or re-experiment with those things, are actually doing this by looking around and looking at what other states do. So there's an important element of competitive emulation and mimicry of what's happening elsewhere. We have a whole chapter in the book which is dedicated to unpacking how this happens and why. But yes, so states sort of try and copy each other. They look at what's fashionable elsewhere, a bit of green industrial policy, a bit of creating a sovereign wealth fund. All that kind of stuff is also important to understand how those modalities of state capitalism travel. Now, the other thing that I should say too, and this is partly a function of the point I made earlier about the excess of power of the French capitalist class in relation to labor in France, is that this is a function of neoliberalism and the extent to which the country and the state has been neoliberalized. And here, the important point, in fact, was partly mentioned by Lee in his question, which is that all of the stuff that we're talking about here is happening, of course, after or in the shadow of 3 decades of neoliberalism, which has transformed class relations, as I was just talking about, but also transformed the state quite deeply in terms of its institutions, how it operates, how it conceives of its role, and so on and so forth. And here it's quite clear that the states the countries where the states have experienced the deepest degree of neoliberalization seem to be having the most difficulties to adapt to this new state capitalist moment. And for the obvious reason that if you seriously erode your capacities to do industrial policy, the knowledge that you have in the state, the expertise, the skills, all that kind of stuff, well, even if suddenly overnight you want to do industrial policy again, you're going to do it probably very poorly because you've been destroying those capabilities for 30 years before that. Now, it doesn't mean that it's not possible, and we may be surprised with how quick those capabilities can be reconstructed, I think. And it's also the case that, or rather, there are cases where the erosion of neoliberalism had not fully degraded those capabilities. They were merely dormant. And there are many developing countries where that is the case, including Brazil, for instance, or even a small country like Senegal, where for a long time the state didn't do any form of planning or industrial policy anymore, but the capacities to do it were not entirely destroyed. They were sort of passive in the background. And when there was a bit more of a sort of a global momentum for those things, there was an ability to sort of re-embrace and revive some of those dormant capabilities. But again, the obvious point here to make is that this new state capitalist moment is happening in the shadow of neoliberalism. It is deeply shaped by it, and therefore, this leads to a lot of waste, a lot of failure of those attempts, of those state capitalist impulses, and so on and so forth.
Well, I guess that leads on to the next question about whether this is part of neoliberalism or something else.
Yes, and the sort of tagline of this podcast used to be, what comes next? And I suppose part of the question is this something next? Is this something new? And I sense from our conversations, your thoughts might be shifting on this, Ilias. But in the book, at least, you say, look, contemporary state capitalism involves some aspects that seem a clear break from classical neoliberalism, right? Hayek is going to be spinning in his grave to see the level of state ownership and control, trade and investment restrictions, and so on. But this is going alongside continued marketizing impulses, attempts to liberalize markets, right? It's not only deluded Keir Starmer going off and signing trade deals. The rest of the world is trying to cling on to trade liberalization as well. Tax cuts and austerity seem to be the policy template. So these things are going along together. You rightly say there seems to be no clean break from neoliberalism. And so the way that you make sense of it in the book is to say this is a kind of moment within neoliberalism, a mutation of it, as it's had many different forms. We've talked already about roll back, roll out, maybe state capitalism is a third moment. But you do leave out, you leave open the possibility that at the moment what we see is a quantitative rise in state involvement in the economy. But maybe there's a tipping point where this becomes something qualitatively new. And I wonder whether you think that tipping point has been reached, because I know you have your doubts now about the mutation label.
Yes, thanks. That's a great question. And I indeed feel less confident that what we're seeing now is simply a mutation of neoliberalism. But let me step back for a second and unpack a bit what I meant by that. What we thought was quite important in the book was to argue against the commonsensical view that state capitalism being about state ownership, trade restrictions, muscular interventionism, blah, 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 all that being going against neoliberalism, and therefore state capitalism being something antithetical to neoliberalism. Now, it seemed to us that this was the wrong way to approach the question, partly for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. That in a way, state capitalism is something that comes from within neoliberalism, so there is something to theorize about this. But also because, in fact, a lot of that stuff, a lot of state ownership, a lot of industrial policy, and so on, was done in a very neoliberal way, or at least in ways that are broadly consistent or which broadly conform with wider neoliberal logics. So to sort of reconcile this paradox, we thought that the concept of mutant neoliberalism, which was first developed by Will Callison and Zach Manfredi, was quite helpful. This is simply the idea that neoliberalism may have a sort of core or a kernel, but it can look quite different. And in fact, it often does look very different, depending on where it manifests, but also because it evolves over time. And it evolves by interacting with all sorts of other things around and by addressing its own sort of limits and contradictions and so on and so forth. So the point we basically made based on this is that what we were arguably seeing was not so much state capitalism replacing neoliberalism, but rather neoliberalism mutating and developing a sort of mutant which was a bit more accepting and accommodating to state ownership and to some forms of state interventionism, but under very specific and limited parameters. So yes, that was sort of the essence of the argument we made in the book. And I should say too that I thought personally that this was quite consistent with a number of arguments made elsewhere on how neoliberalism might be mutating in directions which are less enthusiastic about globalism. The work of Quinn Slobodian, for instance, has shown that you can have variants of neoliberalism which are quite nativist, you could say anti-globalist, which are happy to put some limits on the flow, on some flows of labor and capital and commerce and so on and so forth. So our argument about state capitalism being a mutant variant of neoliberalism seemed to be consistent with that broad line of argumentation. And it's also for the simple reason that a lot of this new state capitalism is about the greater embrace of state power to achieve economic ends of competitiveness, And it's about winning market shares, it's about securing technological and market dominance, a lot of things that might resonate quite easily with the broad neoliberal agenda. Now, in some work I did after we finished writing this book with other co-authors, people like Jack Taggart, Tom Choder, and others, what we've tried to do is think a bit more specifically about each of those signature forms of state capitalism. Sovereign wealth funds, state enterprises, industrial policy, trade restrictions, state-owned venture capital funds, and so on and so forth. And for each of those, we looked at how they are mostly conducted today and the extent to which those were going against market neoliberal logics, or if they were kind of reproducing those neoliberal logics. Our conclusion was that if you look at all of those different things, they kind of all, to a large extent, reproduce neoliberal logics, albeit under slightly new forms. And so our conclusion of this little balance sheet exercise was that overall, they seem to be still about neoliberalism to a very significant extent. But I'm now starting to change my mind a bit, and I'm thinking that maybe this is not a simple question of arithmetic or of balance sheets like that. It's not so much about looking at those individual little things and trying to determine the extent to which they go with or against neoliberalism. Perhaps if we do that, we actually miss something more, some sort of new flavor, which is in the air today, something a little bit more qualitative. And so I'm sort of willing to accept that perhaps what we're seeing today is a world where, yes, you do have a strong continuation of some aspects of neoliberalism, but perhaps we're seeing the contours of something else increasingly strongly today. And I suppose, looking at Trump 2.0 and the chaos that it's unleashed in the space of a few months has really convinced me that things can change pretty rapidly. And even though looking at the small parts of that change, you could ultimately conclude that nothing too much is changing. In fact, overall, there's some pretty radical transformation at play. And this might indeed push us into something new. And I think we should be open to that. And again, the slight problem of the notion of mutant neoliberalism is that it becomes really hard to determine when the mutant becomes something else.
I think part of the difficulty, this is where it relates partly to the conversations we've had about geopolitics on the podcast, is there is no, as you say, there's no clean break. So if we look at kind of previous regimes of accumulation or patterns of economic management, you think about the period of Keynesianism that followed World War II, the decisive moment was the Bretton Woods Conference and the end of World War II, and then you get this kind of managed system. The shift to neoliberalism also involved a conscious effort on the part of both capital and the state to address crises in the existing order and bring about something quite new. Yes, it was somewhat experimental, but it was informed by a coherent ideological package and policy set. And this links to what we were saying earlier on about the disorganization of capital today. That was not the case in the 1980s. There's loads of research showing that business in the United States in particular organized itself very strongly in peak bodies and effectively controlled the Reagan administration, which implemented policies pushed by neoliberal think tanks, which had been around for a long time, like the Heritage Foundation. Today, it's very different. There is no one big bang after which everybody gets around the table and says, okay, this is going to be the new order. It's more, I guess we could say it's the decay of neoliberalism under the weight of its own contradictions, which is fueling ad hoc efforts to repair and address some of the problems and contradictions, not least political contradictions. So what you were saying earlier on about France, for example, why does the French state do various things, or why did Biden try to do various things in the United States? It was not necessarily because you've got fractions of capital organizing themselves for a new hegemonic project. On the contrary, it's the decay of capitalist hegemony, which forces the political class into trying to do something, as you say, in this desperate way, because their own political domination is being undercut. as a result of the contradictions of neoliberalism. And so consequently, we're in this moment where it's very ad hoc. It's a fusion of different things. And yeah, it does raise this thorny question of methodology, because as a good Marxist, as you say, you want to avoid ideal type theorizing, right? Okay, so neoliberalism involves, these 5 policies, and if we don't see these 5 policies anymore, then we've got past it. That would be one way of saying, okay, these are the benchmarks against which we can measure reality and say how useful neoliberalism is as a framework, or when we know it's over. And that's one way of doing it. And I understand why you don't want to do that. And I dislike ideal typical theorizing myself as a Marxist. But how else would we do it when we don't have this clear-cut, big bang, intentional thing that you can name after specific philosophers or economists or political leaders?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and quite frankly, I'm still wrapping my head around this. I'm not too sure I have a fully formed answer to it. There's moments where I try and think, of course, in terms of those basic tenets of neoliberalism. If we think about neoliberalism as being a class political project, it's about transforming the state to empower capital versus labor and to enforce market discipline across society. There's still a lot of that, but there's other things as well going on. If you think about neoliberalism as being about putting together a form of depoliticized corporate power, I think this is also increasingly being challenged. There's a re-politicization of economic relations, which is really rapidly happening. Geopolitics is a very important aspect to that as well. So yeah, I think that there is some value in thinking about those core tenets and the extent to which they are being under strain, given ongoing developments. That said, and you kind of made the point in your question, I think we really should be wary about neat periodization, in the sense that there's no reason why there would be a clean break between neoliberalism and what comes next, but there is also no reason that the decay would not last for a long time, nor is there a reason for a fully formed project, as you said, to come after it. You can just have a decay of neoliberalism, perhaps, and then a bunch of different other things going on, pushed by different groups.
But why do you think that is, just to push you on that point? Because I agree with you. It doesn't seem like there is a need for a project. Is it because of the weakness of organized labor?
Possibly, yeah.
Like the weakness with the strength of organized labor was the problem for why do we need Keynesianism? Why do we need managed capitalist economies? Because of the rise of interwar instability, the rise of fascism, the rise of communism. With fascism dead, the threat was from communism. You have to stabilize Western capitalism and produce growth and full employment. Otherwise, ... The problem in the 70s was also the power of organized labor, which had increased under Keynesianism, and that had to be broken to restore a profitability crunch. So you need some new hegemonic project that's going to destroy the old or build something new from its ashes. And it's the problem today that the capitalist class, the political class, just doesn't really see the need to make the kinds of big decisions to craft something new.
I completely agree with that. I think surely this is part of the story. There seems to be, some sort of attempt at using the question of national security and the threat of geopolitical rivals as a sort of meta-narrative instead of building an actual social contract between classes. Yeah, so I can only agree with you on this. When looking at the Trump administration at the moment, there's obviously things which are very neoliberal. I mean, this big beautiful bill is an awful neoliberal beast. Plenty of things to characterize as neoliberal in what Trump is doing. Some other things, it's a little more questionable. One thing that perhaps would switch the lens of analysis would be to look at class configurations and their relation to the state. And in this case, what is happening quite rapidly is a sort of composition of class forces in and around the state, and we can see that with the reconfiguration of the military-industrial complex, which is much less dominated now by the more traditional, military and defense conglomerates, but a lot more staffed with and dominated by the tech barons of Silicon Valley and like tech executives. I mean, the beautiful example I saw the other day is tech executives from Silicon Valley, people like the CTO of Palantir and OpenAI, have now been given a formal role of officers in the US Army, which I think is obviously is an anecdotal example, but does show something about the fusion of state and private actors in the state, which is of course very much related to the conversation we had today and the problematique of state capitalism. But this is happening incredibly fast under the Trump administration. Yeah. I mean, of course, there were some antecedents under Biden, but now this is just really, really happening very fast. And I do think that this is perhaps where we see something quite different from neoliberalism. So the class configurations look, and especially within the capitalist class and its relation to the state, look very different.
Yeah, I guess saying neoliberalism or something else has political stakes in terms of what our expectations are, what kind of class configurations come out of it, or indeed post class struggle capitalism and the changes even within the composition of the ruling class. I mean, which comments you've just hinted at. But I guess to finish this off, we do have two questions about, one, what's the bad future, and one, what's the good future, to put it very basically. The bad future, which I'll come to first, is basically China, our future, right? Is that absent any genuine popular contestation, which could really strike fear into the heart of the ruling class, let alone seize power, that this is where capitalism will kind of naturally head, as it kind of counter crisis tendencies, which all kind of flow into effectively state capitalism, what you call state capitalism, will eventually become overwhelming. And then it'll be quite clear this is no longer the neoliberal era. We can date it from 79 to whatever you want, 2008. Maybe historians will already say that was, or 2020, or whenever it might be, 2025, and that we're cleared in something new. And that's one kind of bad future. Maybe I'll allow you to address that before we ask about what the good future might be.
Thanks. Yes, that's a great way to to frame the question. Bad future, and I would say that this is already our bad present, actually. So one thing here briefly to say, and this is something we discuss in the conclusion of the book, is that if we are correct in our analysis of the determinants of this new state capitalism, then state capitalism is here to stay in the near future. It's with us, and so the question is how it's going to develop. Now, we think that the climate crisis and the unraveling of US-led hegemony and world order are going to act as further catalysts to state capitalist transformations. And here, we can already see some pretty scary stuff at play. It's very easy to envisage a configuration of state capitalism, perhaps not a la China, but at least something that would be about the increasingly indistinguishable fusion of state-owned and private corporate actors working alongside each other across government, industry, and national security. That would be, a form of capitalism, of state capitalism, where you would have the political imperative of raison d'etat against both the enemy within the nation and also against menacing geopolitical rivals, which would justify the uncontrolled use of state repression, surveillance, and so on. Again, something that we kind of see already at play. And I should say that this is becoming particularly obvious in the context of the burgeoning scrambles over AI and critical minerals. Now, if you look at what's happening in that space, This is material that is not in the book. I'm writing a few essays on that question. In fact, what we see is that state-owned corporate entities, state-owned investment funds are literally the shock troops of those new AI and critical mineral wars. They operate alongside national security agencies, defense contractors, tech giants, and also energy and mining conglomerates. Super clear in the US, but also in the UAE, in Saudi Arabia, in Russia, China. The European Union is trying to do some of that with its own self-inflicted neoliberal straitjackets. So, all this is quite scary, and it's sort of pointing in the direction of a sort of military imperial techno-fascist state capitalism. I mean, at the risk of accumulating those qualifiers, this is really what is happening. And so if those tendencies persist and consolidate and become an actual form of class rule, which becomes the dominant form of class rule in capitalism, I mean, that would be pretty dark and pretty disastrous for our future. And in the end, I think this, we would get basically the worst of the state and the worst of capital. This is so that's the answer to the bad future question, which is almost a bad present answer.
Yeah, I mean, I've often said that we have the worst of the state and the worst of the market already, which is market Stalinism. And by the Stalinism, I actually just mean hyper bureaucracy. But you are, of course, right that Stalinism was more than that, and it could always get worse. So, as I like to say, which is, I suppose, why George compares me to Coldplay. So let's think about the positive podcasting to commit suicide to. I'll go against character and let's talk about the potential good future, because this is something you talk tantalizingly about in the conclusion. And you mentioned the re-politicization, the fact that the state now intervenes so openly in the market and has done since 2008. You don't need to be a Marxist political economist to see this. You can just look on the news and you can see that the state spends, hundreds of billions of dollars when it wants to. And that has opened up space for the contestation of what the state is doing. And, you're pointing out there's a secular tendency here towards growing state control of economic resources. So the growing concentration of capital, but in the hands of the state. And that idea of sort of the concentration of capital, it really, as I was reading it, it really reminded me of a book that we discussed way back on episode 59, The People's Republic of Walmart, which is co-authored by Lee Phillips, one of my fellow contributing editors on Bungercast. And they argue in that book that there's a similar kind of concentration happening within the gigantic cartels, I suppose, that kind of manage the global economy, Walmart in this case, that have developed these incredibly complex transnational planning systems that are ripe for democratic takeover. So the old problem of state planning, well, planning has now occurred within the corporation. If we could just take over that is a tantalizing prospect. There's an even more tantalizing prospect with the rise of state capitalism, which is that it's the state that's doing it. And the state is, in some cases, already notionally democratic and at least potentially open to democratic control. That raises the prospect then of popular control over very large swathes of the global economy, and potentially with instruments also to discipline the remaining private capital, but only if a democratic movement is able to seize state power. So tell us your thoughts about this.
Yes, thank you. Great question. Yes, and I should say first that it was finishing the book on a slightly hopeful note was deliberate. I think it's important for teaching as well. So that was a deliberate move on our part. But I'm not holding my breath. And the reason for that is something we've discussed a bit earlier, which is that it is not so easy to disentangle the productive state capitalist impulse, say, from the disciplinary state capitalist impulse. And which means that, it would not be so easy for a progressive democratic movement to seize the state, and so, or perhaps not even seizing the state, just to push the existing states to do a little bit more of the potentially progressive, or at least less destructive stuff. and while sort of diffusing the bad authoritarian, violent aspect to it. It would be really hard to disentangle those two things. I'm not saying it's impossible, but given how the two are rooted in the same tendencies, it would be really difficult. So that's one thing to say. The second thing is that the sort of channels that, the left, the reformist movement, the trade union movement, has used the channels that were used in the past to put pressure on the state to engage in more reformist ways have been completely eroded. So if you think about the institution of liberal democracy, those don't work quite well for reasons that you've covered extensively in this podcast. So that would be very difficult too. Now, so that puts some real obstacles to a project which would consist in trying to green state capitalism and to make it a bit more democratic. That's one thing. Now, the more revolutionary scenario would indeed to consider that a democratic movement will seize the state, and as it does so, finds itself in the possession of all the capital which has been centralized and concentrated by the state in its hands as a direct consequence of the rise of this new state capitalism. Now, that would sound like an interesting prospect, and you could say that this is really something that is objectively there as a means to potentially seize for a democratic movement. And this is really interesting from the perspective of disciplining capital, potentially, but also from the perspective of reclaiming the investment function, meaning the power to allocate resources across society, which is a tremendous social power that is basically robbed from us by capital. Now, you could say, democratic movement conquers the state and now it finds itself in the possession of all of its capital. It could now, to a significant extent, control how that capital is invested, and it could use this and harness it for a program of transition. That would sound good, but I think, and this is where the analogy that you've established in your question with the question of planning and large transnational corporation is very apt, is that in the end, we wouldn't be able to just seize that centralized capital and do whatever we want with it. And this is partly because this form of centralization of capital is heavily mediated by the financial system. And we couldn't, and presumably a democratic movement would want to do something about the financial system, which would most likely imply very drastically reduce it in terms of the assets that it features and restructure it, which would mean that there would be a huge destruction of assets and capital, which technically would be in the possession of this democratic movement in power. So a bit, again, like the question of planning and the planning capacities and functions developed by transnational corporations, yes, those could be useful and could be used to some extent, but not as is. They would require some very significant transformation to be used for some progressive project.
All right, excellent. There's so much to think about there. I'm going to have to re-listen to this afterwards. Ilias, though, thank you very much. This has been excellent.
Thank you so much. That was a lot of fun.
Very good. We'll have to have you on to continue this discussion at another point in time. But that's it for now. Catch you later. Bye-bye.